Today we're sitting in with Carson Funderburk, Chief Supply Chain Officer at Sara Frozen Bakery.
It was great. So high energy, had me engaged the entire time.
I think what's great about Kevin's message is that, no matter how naturally talented you are, no matter how great you can be, you can always keep striving for that next level. And even, if you become complacent, you might not even realize you've done it. But Kevin really helps you realize, that there's so much more that you can do. If you take a step back, really reevaluate what you're doing and what you're not doing, you can take it to the next level.
I loved his message about God's gift to you and your gift back. And he's just so down to earth and just a helpful, wonderful man.
Really, I think you can put him in front of anybody and you're going to be inspired, you're going to be motivated, you're going to want to go out there and you're going to want to start, reaching for that next level today.
Hey, thanks so much for joining in to the Leadership is Personal podcast, bringing you real-world solutions to real-world challenges in anywhere from 3 to 10-minute increments. Leadership is personal. Here's the better results.
Carson, how the heck are you?
I'm well, Mr. Kevin Wright. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing wonderful. If it wouldn't better, it would hurt. Let me tell you. Today we're talking about code switching and authenticity. And I thought it would be an interesting perspective for the listeners to think about it from the standpoint of supply chain, and a lot like sales where you really have to interface with people in order to get your work done. So talk to me, if you will, about code switching and authenticity from your perspective.
Well, I would tell you, so when I first heard this term code switching, I have to be honest with you, I didn't resonate with it because I do think that there are always an opportunity to appeal to different audiences. Mm-hmm. And so, I thought the word code switching was a bit far for me in terms of how I think about my style and my interactions with vendors, with my peers, with the other functions that I work with. I always believe that whether you are talking to a board of directors at a nonprofit or whether you're talking to some investors, so I get an opportunity, I often talk to our investors as this is a private equity opportunity here at Sara Lee, or if I'm talking to vendors, you do have to switch up your presentation style. You have to read the audience. You have to know that. But I don't know if that's different than if you're sitting at a family reunion, or if you're at a certain church, or if you are with a fraternity, or you're with, whatever. I do think that you have to, I think the people who are most successful can figure out how to be authentic, but to also adjust to their audience.
So that's interesting because you say you have to switch up, we'll call it. What do you mean by switch up? Do tell. Say a little bit more.
Again, I think if I'm talking to a board of directors for a nonprofit, I want to appeal to, the strategic emphasis of what they're looking for. Mm-hmm. If I am talking to some investors for an organization, I know that I need to be selling and asking for capital expense dollars and really talk about return on dollars. Mm-hmm. If I am talking to call it my people, my employees that work for me, I need to be inspirational. I need to be leading, and I probably don't need to be talking about dollars and cents like I would talk to the investment community. And so I think you do have to switch it up. But I'm not sure I would go all the way at calling it code switching. I think you have to know your audience, and the people that are most successful know their audience, and they are agile and they flex to their audience's style. So
what I heard you say was more about content coverage, right? What are you covering? But I think what I'm asking too is when you say switch it up, is there a means of switching up how you approach your audience? Like for instance, some would say code switching. One of the things that I might have to do that some might call code switching, as a 6'4", 340-some pound brother, I have to lean back a little bit so as to pull people in, right? Because I take up a little bit of airspace. And so, Carson, and we tend to give our listeners a sense of what the person that I sit down with looks like. Carson is probably one of the most finely dressed gentlemen that I know. And I use gentlemanly on purpose because the last time I saw him, he had quite the gentlemanly suit on. 3 people, that is. Yes, lapels on the vest. But anyway, Carson, how tall are you?
I'm 5'10" on a great day.
Okay, so you're 5'10" versus someone like me that's 6'4", and we had Anton on who is 6'6". And, we've had people on that sort of are taller versus, say, a 5'10" may not be as imposing. And so when you talk about switching it up, how do you manage your physicality when you're addressing these audiences?
So you said so you're getting just into how do you manage perception and how does your style in terms of your personification play into it? I still think it's the same thing. I still believe that, whether I am a Black man talking to an investment community, I'm not going to be, hands on the table, leaning over, with an aggressive style.
Mm-hmm.
If I am, if I am, again, pitching an idea, I'm probably going to be a little bit more collaborative and less aggressive and inviting people in. And I think not only is it the content of what you're saying, it's all of it. There are different ways to communicate, right? And I do think you have to take those factors into play. Let me give you an example. I think just because I'm an African American, going back to this authenticity slant of this conversation, should I show up different? Should I hold my head down? Should I not walk should I walk a different way than I normally walk? I would say no. You get what you get. And if you don't like what you get, then, I have a choice and you have a choice. But I think the best you can be with an audience, whether it's at the investment community, it's a board of directors for a nonprofit, whether I'm standing in front of my peers, I think the best way you win is to be as authentic as you can be. Now, I do think there's a difference between authenticity and style. I'm not going to wear dashiki to an investment meeting. I am, there's certain things I'm not going to do. I am going to wear a suit when a suit is required. But in terms of who I am and my voice that I bring to the table and my ideas and how I share, all that's going to be the same. I'm not switching any of that up.
Mm-hmm. I understand. You mentioned the fact there that there are different ways to communicate. I think it's important to note that there are a number of studies. I know Yale just did one that talk about how people actually hear and believe what you say. And so 38% of what people believe has everything to do with your tonality. And about 55% of what people believe what you say has to do with your physicality. And that's why I really wanted to understand, when we think about your physicality, what do you do with that relative to code switching or not code switching?
Oh, absolutely. See, so again, so my natural authentic self is to dress for the occasion. And so again, if I need to be in front of the investment community, I'm probably going to have on a blue suit.
Gotcha.
If I need to be presenting to a board of directors, I'm probably just going to have a sport coat on. If I, yes. But for me, and maybe that's why it's a far, I think it's a far reach for me to call it code switching. I do that naturally.
Gotcha.
That is part of my natural.
It's authentic for you.
It is like, okay, today's event is a community service project that requires this, and this. Put on that. Today's event is this, and this. Put on that. I'm going to go talk to a plant of union employees. They don't want to see me in a blue suit. They definitely don't want to see a Black man in a blue suit. So I have to.
Now, what makes you say they definitely don't want to see a Black man in a blue suit?
Well, I think, if I showed up in a blue suit, it would be obvious that I wasn't fitting into their culture. I think that if I showed up as a Black man in a blue suit, that might be just taking it a bit, not only am I not showing up, to fit in their culture, but I look different. So that's two things. So, and maybe the code switching piece, which, I can admit maybe is just part of my DNA. And maybe that's why, again, I don't think about it as a far reaching thing. I've had to do this my entire life. And so maybe code switching is my experience. And I don't even see it as code switching anymore. It is just what I do. It is how I show up. I know that if I am going, running outside, I cannot wear a black hoodie.
So I've had guests on who said, to hell with that. I'm not code switching for anyone, and I am me. But frankly, that could be, for a guy with your presentation, that could be the difference between life and death, right? So we talk about, maybe it's called code switching, right? But I've been instructed and do instruct folks, if you're pulled over by the police, roll down all the windows and turn all the lights on. And so maybe that's a notion of knowing your audience and meeting your audience where they are. So talk to me a little bit about when you go to the plant, if you mentioned about fitting into their culture, right? And so let's talk a little bit about that from the standpoint of, let's say some of my listeners may be moving into a new company, right? You're not that long at Sara Lee. What types of things that you do that maybe could be different in terms of, or maybe you did differently than your prior firm, right, in order to bring your full authentic self into a new environment, a new culture? How did you handle that transition? And did you find yourself code switching differently in the new company versus an older company?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question. So I'll tell you that, again, I think when you go into a new environment, part of what must be done to ensure that you're successful is that you read what's happening in the environment. You have to pick up on the cues. You have to know who has the power. You have to understand that, what the dress code is. You have to understand how people deliver. And it doesn't take years to do that. It takes one good strategic meeting. If you're at the headquarters, it takes one interaction with the union executive. If you're at a plant, it takes one failure analysis, root cause failure analysis session. If you're doing continuous improvement, to understand how people work together. And once you get it, you know what to do. You know what needs to be done. And again, this whole authenticity piece, I am not shy when it comes to conflict. I am not shy about when people ask me my opinion. I always state, do you really want to know the answer? Because I'm going to give it to you. I am very direct, but there is still a way you deliver it. I can't be in a blue suit. I am meeting people where they are. This whole active listening thing, I think I learned this well over the course of my career, probably not necessarily at my last firm, but people's words don't actually say what they mean. Their body language all the time, though. You can read body language faster than the words. Body
language. You mean as in 55% of that I just mentioned, right? I mean,
you're right. Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. You can tell if somebody's interested in what you're saying. You can tell if they want to be there by their body language. You can tell if they're what they've communicated verbally is right. If they're saying yes but shaking their head no, then you know that they're not necessarily being truthful. In fact, they're lying. There's just so much you can just read into body language. And in fact, body language is more important than hearing the words that come out of people's mouth. Are you supportive? Well, did you get up and come to the meeting? Well, if you didn't, then you're not supportive, even though your words said it, right? Yeah. When we had this particular presentation on calling the topic of diversity and inclusion, did you stand up and affirm anything? Or were you just in the room?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, quite honestly, I think this region, so while Carson sits in Chicago, he spent quite a bit of time in the Minneapolis, Minnesota region. And I think this particular region makes you pretty keen on body language and tonality because I would call this the first place I've ever worked where yes doesn't mean yes and no doesn't mean no. And so you really do have to be even more attuned to cues and what someone's saying without them actually saying it.
You absolutely, but I would tell you that even on the East Coast or in New York, where people are going to tell it like it is, body language is still really, really, really important. Because in those places, people sometimes over-exaggerate what they're thinking, and their body language may be more reserved. Mm-hmm. And so reading those cues is important. So back to your original question, I think what I took to this firm was I'm brand new. I had an opportunity to come here and really develop the culture. So as a chief supply chain officer, I am building a supply chain. I'm building a procurement organization. I am fostering a couple of plants that we purchased from Tyson, and I am building out a logistics supply network. And so, when I stand up and give our value statements as a company, people not only listen to the words, but then they look at, okay, what did he do when he was in our plant or in our bakery? Did he really come out and really engage the way he said he was going to engage? And when he's asking for 100% of our employees to be involved, is he inserting himself? Is he naturally connecting the folks? And because, there might be 500 people at a location, you're not going to know 500 people's names, especially if you don't get there often. But the fact that you're out there saying, I'm sorry, I remember the last time we talked about your cookbook, but I can't remember your name, goes a longer way than me not going out and engaging. And so, I would say that, and again, this is part of the adjustment. Like, you have to go put yourself in that culture. You have to go meet people. You have to understand what the norms are. And then, I've got multiple locations. What I do there is very different than when I go to my plant in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. My plant in North Carolina is hey, honey, sweetie, how you doing?
Mm-hmm.
And
that's interesting, right? Because as you know, next month is #MeToo. And so some areas may not find that very comforting. And so, that's some code switching, right? I mean, to be able to deal with that versus if you were to do that in a Minneapolis. So talk to us a little bit about how do you manage that piece?
You just got to know, you have to know the environment that you're going into. And then, oftentimes when you walk into that environment, it takes a quick assessment to say, okay, I'm in Michigan. This is what they do in Michigan. I'm in North Carolina. This is what they do in North Carolina. I'm in Minneapolis. This is what they do in Minneapolis. And I would subscribe to you. That's no different than when I go home, whether it is my home in Minneapolis, there's a certain way we behave in our home. Mm-hmm. And there's a certain way that we behave. I think about my extended family in North Carolina and South Carolina. There's just certain things. And again, is it code switching or is it adjusting to where you are? And I think a lot of people, and the reason I kind of put it in that hole, is it a bit too far reaching? Because I think people think about the word code switching as a negative term. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not going to put on the black sweatshirt because why should I have to do that? Well, why should we have to do anything? Why can't I say this at a family reunion, but I can say it why can't I wear this to church? Or why can't, there are what I call rules of engagement, regardless of where you go. And it's a matter of fact of, do you want to play by the rules? And at the end of the day, as I think about it in the corporate term, the better you play, the more you get paid.
Yeah, well, there is that. But I would also say, to the extent where possible, the more that you can bring your authentic self to work, the better off you are, right? Yeah. I mean, there are some people who I think take it to the extreme and sort of manufacture someone different when they're in various different settings, as opposed to bringing their full selves. And so help me to understand, what does bringing your full self mean when you go and talk to Beulah, who says, hey, baby, as opposed to when you're going to talk to a VC in Chicago? What does that bringing your full self sort of look like?
Let's use an example of conflict.
Okay.
So if I see an unsafe situation at my bakery in Tarboro, North Carolina, mm-hmm. When I go address that situation, there are probably some things I need to do so that people can actually hear me.
Gotcha.
Right? I probably need to say, hey, how you doing? My name is Carson. I've been down here a couple times. You and I have met at least 2 occasions before. Love what you guys do, but you need to stop. You're about to be and I want to make sure that you can return back to your family the same way you came to work. Now, I know this is probably odd that someone of my, position would come out to the floor and then obviously notice that something is wrong and want to have a personal conversation with you. But this personal conversation has to be had because I care about you. Hmm. All right. If I go have a conversation with someone who's not performing in HEP corporate because we needed to do, let's say, a project, for an example, I would need to communicate and deliver it such that someone could hear me. Mm-hmm. So my point is that I am still going to be direct. I am still going to tell people what I'm thinking, mm-hmm. but how I navigate that, I need to meet people where they are.
So it's really just about speaking the language of your audience, mirroring your audience or understanding how it is that your audience engages and communicates. I totally get that. I totally get that. You happen to be the first person in supply chain that we've had on. And so as you think about moving from one space to the next, as you go from VC to plant floor, is there some sort of ritual that gets you ready for that? How do you prepare yourself? Now, I recognize you've been in the industry a long time, so it probably happens at the snap of a finger, but how do you gear yourself up?
In my office, because I'm a supply chain person, and I do manage what I would call people at a plant level. I manage people at a corporate headquarters. I also, again, as I mentioned before, talk to investors, etc. In my office, I have, I've got jeans and a t-shirt.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a sport coat.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a suit.
And a tie, I take it.
and well, a lot of people don't wear ties in, so I only wear a tie to church now. So again, you have to be prepared for anything, right? When I am going to talk to people on the floor at one of my locations, I know that there are probably only 2 Black folks working in that plant.
Mm-hmm. And
I already know that when I get on that floor, there's an opportunity to delight. And that's how
I don't know what the hell that means, so we're going to have to cover that part, but keep going.
So there are times when people are going to be curious, and this may be their first interaction with an African-American male.
Okay.
This may be their first time with an interaction with an African-American male, even at this level. So there is an opportunity to delight. There's an opportunity to go out and have a real conversation and have people have a new perspective of what this or any Black male can look like in a corporate environment. And so, I think my gear up, I would say maybe about 10 years ago, I probably was gearing up for these kind of conversations, these interactions. But now I look at it as an opportunity to delight. And sometimes I get out there and I just show out now.
Like, what do you mean by show out?
I already know in certain situations that people might be second guessing, how did this particular person get this particular position at this particular company? And so it's an opportunity for me to go out and delight and probably, pull them in a bit more than probably the average Joe Blow would do. And, really, connect. So much so that, they're asking for me to come back.
Well, I don't know who said it, but somebody said leadership is personal. So I totally understand that. Personal.
Leadership is personal, man. And I tell you, there's just always an opportunity to delight. There's an opportunity to educate. There's an opportunity to give people a different perspective. And then there's an opportunity to do the damn job.
Do the damn thing, huh?
Do the damn thing, and you just go out and do the damn thing, and it's amazing that most of the time the people that had probably some, call it intrepidation about my particular presence are the people that love me the most.
Is that right?
Yep. Because I was able to.
That's often the case, man.
Yep.
It's often the case. And I appreciate you said, and do the damn thing, right? Because that's the kind of podcast that we have, right? We like to keep it really real. We don't want any BS. Don't be feeding us any corporate line, right? We talk about the stuff that people often want to talk about or maybe talk about, but only when they look around first and make sure people ain't looking, right? And so, the real value in this podcast, I think, and what I've heard from people, as far as Uruguay and Africa, is that the value is in getting the real perspective, hearing from guys like you that are in the room, in many rooms that a lot of people aren't in, and also from the people like you who listen to the podcast when I have folks on who give them a perspective that they don't get because when they show up, everything is so sterile. They fixed it all so that it looks nice and pretty and clean for when you get there, right? You do recognize that happens, right? I'm sure you got to straighten it up a little bit for when you show up.
Absolutely.
That's just the way it works, right? Everybody is on their P's and Q's and on their best behavior. And so as we, like I said, I won't take a whole lot of your time. We are certainly glad that you came out and was willing to spend some time with us and give us your expert tutelage. But what would you say to someone? I'm going to ask you 2 questions. One, what would you say for someone that's aspiring to get to that chief supply chain officer role that needs to understand what it requires in the way of, I won't call it code switching, but I'll call it meeting your audience where they are? What do you think is required there?
So it takes, so you have to know your job. So you have to be almost a technical expert. Mm-hmm. And you have to also remember that, I'll go back to what you said. Leadership is personal. People who rise up in the supply chain function are not necessarily the best engineers, or will be the deepest technical strength of engineering or the deepest strength of logistics, but is someone who can connect to folks, connect to their sales function, connect to their marketing function, someone who understands, the basics of what they're doing and can deliver outstanding results. But it's really the connectors that are the people that get to, what I call the executive level positions. When I was an engineer, I was a phenomenal engineer, but had I continued to double down on just the principles of engineering, I would have been an individual contributor working on, solely on technical problems. Mm-hmm. What I really needed to rise in the leadership ranks was the ability to connect to people, the ability to problem solve, the ability to inspire, the ability to engage, the ability to develop someone, to sit down with someone and say, while this is never, an easy thing to do, I feel compelled to tell you these are your development opportunities. Like, if no one else has told you this, I need to tell you this because I care about you. I want you to succeed. And I think when you make it personal, so leadership is personal again, but you are really real and you connect folks and you are honest and you can look people in the eye and you can engage and you can say, I made a mistake when you made a mistake. When you can rise to the top and, take the microphone and say, hey, I believe in you. Whatever it is, you have to connect to people. So the supply chain people who are at the top of the supply chain, or the executives in the supply chain, are those people who can do those kind of things.
It's interesting. I was going to ask you as my second question, what would you say to the people that are your peer group or, that are your peer groups in other organizations or what have you? But I think you answered both sides of that question with your one response, right? I mean, and that's really, Herb Kelleher said it best when he said the business of business is people. And so I think you answered that quite cogently, and I greatly appreciate it. Again, thanks for coming out tonight. We're going to keep it sweet and short, and hopefully people pick up on the nuggets that you sort of distilled for us tonight. Again, leadership is personal. We heard that loud and clear coming from you. That's not a plan. I didn't ask him to do that. It just happened to come out that way. We're talking code switching and authenticity with Carson Funderburk, the Chief Supply Chain Officer for Sara Lee. Thanks a lot for coming, and I look forward to talking to you again real soon.
If you join us here each and every week, you'll get a tidbit of information and insight that'll help you be the best version of yourself. Come back next week. Be sure to join us on Facebook within the Facebook group. Check us out on Twitter and on Instagram. Kevin D. Wright. Look us up. Check us out. Link to us online. Love to hear from you. Unlike some of the other podcasts, I want to hear directly from you, and I will answer your question. There's no question too tough, so together we can solve it. Stop back and tell a friend. Leadership is personal. Here's the better results.